with, and probably over years you'll start to get your mind around this and it will become more of an intuitive thing. So when Saf talks in a moment about thinking about how raw and cool colours interact with one another, all that sort of stuff, if you want to reach a point where you don't have to sit and think so much about that, you actually sort of feel your way through it, if that makes sense. But you have to begin somewhere, which is having somebody explain to you how the basics of this work. So you might want to take notes, it's up to you. There's obviously this stuff will be put up on Flat Ultra, but up on Canvas, but you might want to take notes as you're going along, just with little things that you pick up with what we show you. And not to like blow our own trumpet or anything, but what you will find is as you go on into second and third year, and some of you continue to study beyond this, conversations that we have with students beyond first year where they constantly refer back to one. I wish we could do those demos again so I could get my head back around that, because now I understand what you're trying to get us to think about. So try to take this in and if you need notes to refer back to, you're welcome to do that, or if you want to ask questions as we're going, just jump in.
Excuse me, I have a question. This one looks similar, 1 and 2. Is it good?
Yes, we'll talk. That's project 1. We'll talk about that a bit later.
Do you want mediums or something?
I don't have an order of events, really. Hang on a minute, this video afterwards. Okay, so what we're going to start with here are looking at some fundamental colour combinations. We have spectrum red and we have yellow ochre, and we're going to mix a basic earth red from those two colours.
If you guys on the sides can't see it, I just push it a bit.
You can see that it's kind of neutralised the spectrum brightness a little bit and created a beautiful earthy orange tone. And here we're going to create an earth pink, which isn't really traditionally what we would see as a pink, but you'll see what happens when we mix it with white. It's a lovely clay colour there. Now I'm using a... Yep. It's yellow ochre and burnt umber. So these colours change again when we mix them with white. So that's still quite a lovely pinkish tone. If we add some more ochre, it kind of sullies it up a little bit, but creates the most gorgeous kind of coral pink.
I could eat that pink, I reckon.
Yeah, it's really nice. Salmon. And it's interesting how we call this an earth pink, even though it really isn't very pink. It makes a lovely warm sand colour. So this is the influence of the ochre in both of those colours. Just want to show you what happens when you mix burnt sienna with white, because it makes something closer to what we would call an earth pink, I feel. It's a beautiful kind of warm, a warmer version of this sand colour. So they're really subtle differences, but that's what this project is about exploring. What's the next one, Alex?
I don't have my glasses.
Okay. Oh, now we're going to mix yellow ochre and phthalo. Now you'll remember last week phthalo is a really strong saturated colour. Let's see what happens when we mix it with yellow ochre, because they almost look like quite opposite colours. Let's start with a bit because phthalo is so strong. Look at that colour. Just the most beautiful teal. Mixing that with some white. You can really see it holds its chroma there. It's a stunning colour, almost like an emerald.
So what you'll find in the art shop is obviously, depending on the brand, you'll get a whole lot of tones of colour, particularly say take those blue, green, teals. There'll be a whole range of colours there, and some of them will be super expensive because of the pigment that it takes to make them. There's a whole range of reasons. We're not discouraging you from using those, but I guess hopefully this helps you see that you can actually make a whole range of those colours with some other more basic colour. And it gives you more control over the type of palette that you use in the painting instead of just relying on what comes in the tube.
I think that's an excellent point, Adam, because I see some people's kits and I think, wow, you've got like every shade of pink in there. That must cost a mint. And some of them are series 4, which could be like $60 a tube. So when you know these fundamentals, you know, and these are like series 1. So that would cost you maybe for this size, maybe $25. That will go a long, long way. These are all series 1 paints. I guess we should describe what series are.
Yeah, I was trying to figure that out myself. But,
Okay.
basically, your series 1s are going to be your more basic, cheaper colours. It doesn't mean they're bad colours. My understanding is that they're just easier colours to make. Okay.
Series.
Whereas once you get into things like cadmiums, which is up with your, depends on the brand, but it might be 5, 6. Some brands go up to 7. And I think the ones I use go up to 9, which is even more confusing. And really, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Saf, because maybe there's something else to it, but I think it's mostly to do with how difficult it is to make the colours and how rare the pigments are. Because believe it or not, really high quality artists' oil colours are still made from pigments that are extracted from sometimes very difficult parts of the world to get to, which is fascinating in itself. But that's why you're going to pay more. Cheaper paint will have, so really crappy paint, like student quality paint, what they call student quality paint, you can still do things with it, but what you'll find is that you'll go through it quicker, because in those paints generally there's less pigment to what we call filler ratio. So all paint has some form of filler in it to fill it out. A cheaper paint has way more of that and less of the good stuff. Okay, so that's the basic way to describe that. So yes, you might save money buying student quality paint, but you'll go through it quicker. If you get a good quality paint, you'll find that it actually lasts you longer because the pigment quality is much stronger and you don't have to necessarily use as much.
For example, this is permanent magenta, and it actually is a series 3 paint. So it would be more expensive and it probably have more natural ingredients in it that are harder to source. You can see there that I added quite a bit of white to that, and it's really still very saturated. So it's a really strong colour and it will go a long way. It's what we would call a cooler end of the red spectrum. It's kind of a crimsony, magenta-y, pinky colour, as opposed to the very warm spectrum red. Spectrum red is a series 1 paint that is actually an imitation of cadmium red. Cadmium red is a series 3 or 4 and is a natural, cadmium being a natural element, is quite expensive to make. But a tube of cadmium red, this size, I think I've still got one from when I was a student. It is so potent, like the size of an ant would make that kind of saturation with white. It's really strong. It's beautiful. So let's see what happens when we mix a warm red with a cooler magenta. That permanent magenta is going to dominate because it is a series 4 natural pigment. It's made it quite a lovely neutral crimson. And we can test that out by using some white. It makes an absolutely glowing colour. So you do not need to go to the art store and buy a tube of this colour when you know that you can make it yourself.
I've even had I'm really good friends with my art supplier, my material supplier, and there's times where I'll go and grab a tube of paint that's a really expensive colour and just say, no, don't get that, that's just, all they do is fix these two colours.
He's a good
and
contact.
you already bought those two colours last time you came in, so you just make it yourself. So some of it's to do with money and some of it's also to do with just, it's great to learn the craft of understanding how these things work and taking a bit more control over that yourself.
Mixing my ultramarine blue with permanent magenta. Oh, look at that gorgeous violet. That is a lovely colour. So it's pretty amazing seeing the spectrum of colours we have here, considering there's only one Series 3 colour here. The rest is all Series 1. It's a very affordable way of creating a really vast spectrum of colours without spending all of your money. Sometimes going to the art shop for me is like going to the lolly shop, and you see colours and just think, oh, I've got to have that.
Yes,
And that's, yeah. So what we thought we'd do today, now that we've sort of got a general ballpark on how we can mix our colours together, is show you how they work with the blacks that we've learnt about.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, but all of them has the tone of greys that we learned in the first one?
Well,
tonality, dark light.
You're getting complicated. But you can think of it that way. If you want to take your mid chroma red and mix it with a mid chroma green, you'll get a black of sorts. So yes, you can get into complementary colour mixing to make greys. We weren't going to confuse you with that too much.
No, I was talking about tonality, light and darker.
Oh, light and dark, yes. Well, that's correct. I can darken up my red by adding its
That's probably
complementary.
why we wrote it first, that we understand which colours are cool, which is blue, which are blue.
And some of it's to do with the complementary colour stuff that we talked about last week. So instead of thinking about darkening colours by adding things like black, let's just always avoid that, and all that does is muddy a colour. So you want to think about how colours relate to one another. I don't have a colour spectrum chart in my studio, it's in my mind, so I think if I want to darken a red, I add a little bit of green to it because that's a complementary to it. So it's starting to think about colour as something that is expansive, not a static thing, okay? And that's why I keep coming back to the idea of trying to get to a point where you feel your way through it, where it's an intuitive thing instead of it doesn't have to be an analytical thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah. For example, I'm making some red values here. My darkest red has simply been mixed with green to darken it. And then as we go lighter, I start adding white. So there's an example of a red spectrum that doesn't use black. We can go through this kind of complementary mixing further if you like. We're sort of going in steps, so it's not too overwhelming.
And just getting back to the art store thing, what Saf's just shown you here, if you are on a budget, which, let's face it, we're all on a budget. No one in this room has an unlimited budget for the art store. That would be really
So
awesome.
good.
I see those pictures of famous artist studios like, I don't know, like you see those old photos of Jasper John's studio, and there's just a whole wall of every type of old Holland colour that they've ever made. But what Saf's just shown you, if you're on a budget, you can go to the art store and just buy that list of paints, and you will be able to make a huge range of colours, okay, without spending much money at all. Is there any questions with what Saf's just shown you? Does that make sense? Yeah?
All right. So just to recap, last week we learnt about how to mix blacks. So what I've done is I've put together an example of our school black that we made, our neutral black that we mixed from neutral blue and burnt umber. And then I've shown you what that looks like in comparison to store-bought blacks. So this one here is the colour we call Payne's Grey. It's got a really cool blue bias. This one here is called Mars Black, and this one here is called Lamp Black. And the differences between them are very subtle, but I think what you'll notice is when you mix them with colours, that's when you see what their properties are really like. When I was a student, Peter Ellis told me to only use Payne's Grey. It was sort of favouring a cooler palette. But what can be done is colour correction with glazing, which we're going to show a little bit of.
Okay.
Do you want a bit of maestro of the glaze?
I suppose that I have not prepared. Well, there's a few different ways of doing what we call glazes, and in order to talk about that, I need to talk to you a little bit about what we call mediums and solvents. We could have a whole range of those here, but that would just bombard you with information. So we're keeping this quite simple. And I say all of this under the premise, or under the preface rather, that, as Andre just reminded me, that here you need to be using what we call low toxic mediums and solvents, okay? So when you go to the art shop, you'll see on the shelf things that say low odour turpentine or low odour medium. That's a very different thing. That's not what this is. Low odour just means that they took out some of the things in it that make it really stinky, but it doesn't mean you're not breathing in toxins from it. So low toxic, and I did my research on this a few years ago because I realised I was painting huge big paintings and using a lot of mineral and gum turpentine, which is not very good for you at all over a long period of time. So Language actually make what I think is one of the best ranges in this. So their low toxic mediums and solvents actually have had most of those toxic things taken out of it. So not only are they low, they generally are low odour, but they're also not super harmful. You don't want to go around breathing it still. If I'm working on a really large piece, I still wear a mask and I still open a window and I make sure I've got a fan on, all of those things. Because if you're anything like we were in art school, you will tell yourself, you're invincible and it doesn't matter. But if you want to make art over a long period of time, if you want to make paintings over a long period of time, if you want to at some stage start to upscale your work, if you're interested in making large paintings, then you need to think about taking care of your lungs because they add air into your body that keeps you living, okay?
Your brain.
And your brain. And there are plenty of painters who have died from things that really are probably the result of breathing this stuff in. So what we're going to be using here is low toxic mediums and solvents. Language is not the only brand that does that. You can go to the art store and find a whole lot of versions of that. I reiterate, low odour or non-odour is not the same thing, okay? But Language is a great version, and it's made in Melbourne as well, if that means anything to you. So all this is a paint medium that they have already made up, which will give you a very basic sort of rundown on the side of what you can and can't do with it. And I will be completely honest with you, some of that information is true and some of it isn't true, in the sense that what I've found is you can stretch mediums and solvents to do things that the art people will tell you that you're not meant to do, but you sort of can do it if you know what you're doing.
You will do that stretch.
Stretch, I'll get into that. So that's a medium. So this medium is basically something that you can use to create a glaze, to stretch out any of these colours that Saf's shown you today. You know, basically this is obviously because it's straight out of the tube. All of this paint is the same consistency, but what we want to do is get to the point where you can begin to stretch the paint out to be thicker or thinner depending on what you want. Some of it you can create what we're going to do in a minute, a transparent glaze, something that you can see the undercolours of, okay? Where's that? Oh, here it is.
So the other thing that language make is a low toxic solvent, okay? So basically what they mean by solvent is it basically does what turpentine does, okay? So turpentine, how far do I go into this? If you go to the, what I did in year 12, because I knew nobody who understood how to make an oil painting, I thought, well, I know that you need linseed oil and I know that you need turpentine. So I went to the hardware and I brought linseed oil, which is most likely made for like painting down the decks of boats and stuff like that. And I got mineral turpentine, which is a solvent, but it's not really made to mix with high quality oil paints, because over time, what both of those solvents will do is crack or flake. The linseed oil turned all those paintings that I made that year, I think within about 5 years, all the whites turned yellow. Yeah. And they suddenly look like old masters paintings. Not in the way they were painted, but just in their colour. So let's avoid all of that. But mineral turpentine or gum turpentine, they're all various forms of solvent that you can use in paint. The mineral terps from the hardware, which we don't encourage you to bring in here. In fact, when I say that, not allowed to bring them in because the odour is just too strong. But say you were working at home, okay, that could be used for something like washing brushes. If you're going to do that at home, keep a lid on that whenever you're not using it, because it's going to keep putting fumes into the air, okay? But that stuff from the hardware is not what it's not what we mean when we talk about something like gum turpentine, which comes from the art store. That is something that you can mix into mediums to stretch the paint out, to make it thinner, to make it cover more areas. But if you're going to be doing it in here, you need to use something like this. So that's basically like a gum turpentine, okay? So what I can do is take this medium, and I can use that straight out of the bottle to mix. It'll be a bit shinier because it's got stuff like your basic medium is going to have kind of a solvent, a refined linseed oil or something like that, and a Damar varnish, something like that. So the varnish is going to give it a bit of a shine. But what I can also do is stretch this medium out by adding a little bit of this solvent, and that will make it a little bit thinner, and it will also take away a little bit of the shine. So I personally, just as a totally personal thing, like to make paintings which don't have much sheen or varnish or reflection to them. They're quite matte paintings.
I like shine.
Yep.
So we just use solid oil without mixing any...
Straight out of the tube, you can, but you'll find that you can't stretch the thin and the thickness of it. So you do need to start to explore these as well. Yep.
I have a schminker turpentine. Can I use it?
If not in here, if it's not a low toxic one, then no. So you do need to go and get yourself some of that, and everyone can thank each other for it, because when we were here, it was like...
Oh, we had a trough of turnips in every single
really bad
studio, and the smell was...
You go home with a headache.
It was just in our hair, in our noses, and
Yeah.
people were smoking in here. It's like it's gone up in flames.
What could go wrong? Alright, so what I'll do is, first of all, I'll show you just how to do a very basic glaze, just using a little bit of this medium. And I'm going to get your beautiful chart all messed up. So,
Yeah, go for it.
what will we do? I'm going to try a little bit of this. What did we mix there? It was like a magenta.
It was magenta with ultramarine blue.
Alright. So that should, in theory, give us a kind of at least a semi-transparent glaze. What you'll find with this medium is, that's not a super thick medium, but it's a little bit thicker than if you were to put some solvent in, which I'll do in a minute. And I won't go over the whole thing because I want to see how they interact. If we put a little bit of that over the top, it's not super dark, but what you'll find is it changes this blue and it changes the white around the outside. So you're still seeing the blue, but you're seeing it through a very, very fine, thin layer of another colour. So if we add a little bit more of that, and maybe actually a little bit of this blue.
You can also mix glazes on the palette if you don't want to mix as much as Adam's doing.
Sorry.
No, that's okay.
I
Just saying, you don't have to have 30 jars in your studio.
No.
I usually use my glaze on the palette.
Alright, so as I add something else, it's only very slightly changed it. So if I was to do this with something that already has, say, white in it, does anybody know what difference that might make to what I'm doing here? What will it do to the glaze colour if it had a little bit of white in it? What was that? It'll be milky, what we call opaque.
Yeah, it might
So you won't see through it as much. It won't be a flat colour because there's not enough pigment in the medium.
A way to see how opaque a colour is, because all of these have varying opacities. That's the other complexity to oil paint. On the back of the tube, you'll see either a tiny little square or you'll see a triangle that's solid. The solid triangle means it's going to have good coverage. It's fairly opaque, and if it's not filled in, it's a transparent colour, so it's excellent for glazing. White is the most opaque. See, it's a solid square titanium white. So what can happen if you glaze with it is it goes a little bit spotty. Do you find that?
Yeah.
It doesn't go as evenly as beautiful and glassy as these colours are because they're transparent. So it doesn't like being transparent. It leaves little teeny pieces. But you can still do it if you're not going to be that worried about the texture.
Something I started doing was every now and again in the large paintings I'm making, I mix up a glaze with some white in it, like almost like a really kind of light pinkish colour, and it is opaque. But I put it on in such a way where it's like it creates a cloud over a whole section of a painting. And I can still see that painting, but I just turned all the blacks in it to a kind of really soft white, and then I work again on top of that. So there's ways that you can use it in glazing, but you sort of need to experiment with it. This one, all I've done is add a little bit of that burnt sienna, and it's now made it brownier. And afterwards you can come and wander around here. There's a tiny little space in between those two glazes where you can still see that original blue coming through. So what we're really looking at here is a few things in terms of mediums. The mediums and the solvent will allow you to stretch these paints out in their thinness and their thickness. They will also allow you to affect colours that you've already put down by putting something on the top of them that you can see through or partially see through. So it's almost like you're creating a lens of colours that are, when they're all set up together, they make a colour that you're seeing through, if that makes sense. If we put this on the yellow, you'll see again it does something entirely different to the yellow, okay? Now, does anybody know what would happen if I had painted, or if Saf had painted that yellow in quite thick yellow, and then she put that over the top, and that yellow hadn't completely dried yet? What's going to happen over time? Have a wild guess. What was that?
Like if you apply it on top,
Uh-huh.
really often and have it really dry, and then they will start to.
That will happen if it's like really wet. Oil paint will dry from the outside in, so it'll get a film, yeah?
Yeah.
So what will happen is if that film is thick enough that you can't kind of penetrate the wet stuff on the underneath it, over time, this thinner layer on the top will dry faster, and the thick layer underneath will start to crack. So the general rule is you paint thick on thick.
That's right. Lean to fat.
Lean to fat. But again, that can be stretched a little bit.
You can break the rules.
You can break the rules. But as a general rule, if you paint a really thick oil painting and then 2 weeks later decide I'm going to put a glaze on it, it will very, very, very likely crack in time, okay? So some of it will be mistakes that you make, and that's totally fine. You'll just learn from the mistakes. Any
So
questions
you're
with
not-
that?
You're not glazing, you're glazing on wet,
No.
No.
Glaze on a dry painting.
Yeah.
but you said it will crack.
No, I'm saying it will crack if the underpainting is too thick and hasn't dried yet properly.
Oh, okay.
So glazing isn't really ideal for thicker paintings. If you're an impasto painter, which means thick paint, glazing on top isn't recommended unless you want it to crack, because it will. You could, however, do dry brush techniques to create transparent areas of colour, which won't crack because it's neat fat paint.
What I've done now is add a little bit of that solvent, so this low toxic solvent, to that medium mix. And I don't know what the mix was. It's probably 2/3 that medium, 1/3 solvent. I didn't really think too much about it. And then I put some of this is phthalo, isn't it? Phthalo blue in there, okay? Phthalo blue and Prussian blue and even ultramarine blue are all great colours to glaze with. And what you'll find is...
It makes scientific sense to say that. A student, Tallulah, just asked, when you glaze on top of a painting with a solvent, like you are, wouldn't it reanimate the paint underneath?
Not if... Well, this... When did you paint this,
Well, that's actually acrylic.
Okay.
The other colours are acrylics.
These ones. And they were
Painted
painted
on Wednesday.
on Wednesday. Well, we'll see what happens with those. It should not reactivate it because a thinly painted oil painting should dry. So when I say thinly, I mean no thicker than these. That should dry in like 3 days. If this stuff here, we can come back in a month and that will not be completely dry yet.
Yeah, so those pallets out in the hallway, you can scrape that off and there'll be wet paint underneath. You can use it. I don't know why anybody hasn't done that.
So hold on one sec. So what you're talking about is yeah. What you're talking about is the idea of reactivation. So these that thick, they will reactivate for some time if I really dig into them with a brush. Acrylic paint, which is what Saf's put down here, will dry within less than an hour and it will not reactivate. When I put down water on the top of it, it will stay permanent. If that was watercolour, as soon as I put down water onto it, it will reactivate.
Or wash.
Yep. So that's good to keep in your mind. Most inks will be permanent, some inks are not permanent. But we shouldn't have any problems with the oil paint when it's painted thin like this. Did you have a question?
Yeah, when we, from the last class, we did making black. When I come back to the studio in a couple of days, it dries. Can I reactivate it or not?
Yes. That's why I've shown you glazing today. So just say you made a painting and like
I
me.
don't have to be in each time I come.
No, you don't have to.
Do you mean on your palette?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, you don't. What I do is, because I'm messy and a bit lazy, I just have a giant big palette and I hardly ever clean it. I might clean it twice a year. It's a big piece of glass and I just keep piling up my colour. All the reds are in one spot, all the yellows are over here, and it's probably this thick of paint.
You're like Louisiana.
Yeah, except hers are like
Stalactites.
beautiful. And even I've come back after like a month off and just put a bit of medium on the top and just do this for 2 minutes and the paint comes back alive.
Do you get crumbs though?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
that doesn't bother me.
Okay.
So if you're a much neater painter, that won't work for you. But you can keep it on the palette and reactivate it. Yeah.
That's interesting. That's a great way a lot of people work if they don't mind a little bit of texture, old dried paint flakes in the work, and that can actually add some lovely texture and grit. I'm a real glazy painter, so what I do is I've got a big old chopping board and I cover it with foil every day and I use that as my palette, and then at the end of the day I just scrunch off the foil and chuck it out. So that, that keeps it's a completely non-absorbent surface, just like glass, and that's what you want.
Yeah, but foil doesn't reflect color is white.
No, it doesn't, but I've learned how to get around that.
So what you'll see here is all I've done with this is I added about, so let's say 2/3 medium, 1/3 solvent, and then I put a little bit of phthalo blue into that mix, and it's created this glaze which turns the blue, turns the yellow into a green. But I've done the sides so that you can actually see that's the colour that you're putting down, okay? But that's how it's coming through because you're seeing the yellow coming through that glaze. And that's where you can really experiment with this and see how it affects colours and how you can start to kind of push and pull it a bit. Again, you'll make mistakes and that's fine. What was that? Will this dry out? That's a very, very good question. Those two won't, and I know this from experimenting with them, those two language ones will not dry out in the next month or 6 weeks. But we had another one last week, which was Solvent 75, I think it's called, which is another language one. And that will dry out in 3 days. It will become, at the bottom of the jar, jellyish.
Yeah.
And you'll get a film on the top that you can pull out and reuse what's underneath. But I suspect that whatever's rising to the surface in that film has extracted some of what I wanted in the medium. So I actually don't use that 75 one for that reason. But they make that 75 medium to be able, it's non-flammable, so you can travel on an aeroplane with it.
Right.
Which doesn't sound like, why would you ever want to do that? But if I did a residency over in France a few years ago and all their mediums were different and they were all in French, and I wish that I'd taken something that I could know, that I knew. But so that's why they make that 75 one. But these you shouldn't have any problem. And then, do you want to talk about, you use liquid, don't you?
I do use liquid.
Do you want to talk about that? Because I haven't used it for a long time.
It's much thicker. With liquid, it smells great. But don't go inhaling it.
Don't go inhaling any of this. Is my...
So you can see there, it's like really thick. It's like sort of, I don't know, saucy kind of consistency. And it's really great for every stage of the painting. So you can use it for the very first glazes that you do. I'm going to show you how to change the temperature of these blacks as well. So I'm going to do a little bit of, if I wanted to say take this Payne's grey and make it more of a neutral black, it'd be logical to add a little bit of burnt sienna or burnt umber to that. So let's see how that changes the colour. You can see how it's got more of a lip on it, it's thicker, and you can actually get more of an impasto feel from it. But you can use it in a really glazy way as well.
Did you say glazy or lazy?
Both, I suppose, yeah, glazy, lazy. So you can see by just glazing over that, it neutralises the coolness to some degree.
It looks more smooth.
It's very smooth when you lay it down. We might leave these mediums in here for you guys to have a little play with if you like. So you can see how the colour temperature is getting closer to its neighbours in black and lamp black there.
And the liquid speeds up the dry time, right?
It does, it's really quick drying. It's actually a completely synthetic medium, so it's not your traditional linseed. I think it's got alkyd resins in it and all sorts of other things. But what I do like about it is if you want to get to the later stage of the painting and scumble a bit, scumbling is when you have thicker layers, fatter layers, you can just add a little bit of liquid and get quite a kind of chunkier kind of application. So it still thins the paint out, but you don't lose the colour. It holds its saturation a little bit more. So that's useful if you're a traditional portrait painter, for example, like if we go back to the Baroque and a Vermeer, you would glaze, you would do very thin layers for the first few layers of the painting, and then at the end you would scumble in details like the crust of the bread and the glint of the eye and the weave of the tapestry and things like that that you want to sort of stand out from the painting. You use less medium. So it's very useful in that degree, and it dries overnight. So this would be dry tomorrow, and I can do another glaze on top and get really beautiful colour depth happening. So let's say you did a painting for the limited palette project and you felt it was too cool. You could glaze some burnt umber or burnt sienna onto that and completely transform the whole image. Also, if it was too dominated by phthalo, like my neutral black, you could get some burnt umber. Don't know where that went. Doesn't matter really. And just simply correct that too. But you can, later on in project 2, when you can explore colour, you can start to glaze really yummy magentas into the work and get lovely transparent nuances of colour going on. You can see how magenta loves being glazed. It's just so even and thin.
And it's also, it's what you said last week about how colours interact with one another next to each other. So when I see that next to that really soft grey, it's such a beautiful colour relationship, though, grey and a pink like that. There's such a softness to it. So the colour will look different depending on what colour is next to it as well.
Absolutely. If you glaze with white, like we were talking about before, it just doesn't have the same even consistency. It's much more opaque. So this is kind of a pink glaze. It's pretty smooth actually. That's probably because of the liquid. But you might find that you don't get the transparency that you're after. It's a lot of information.
It's good. It's, as we said, you just got to, it's something to experiment with. But you do need to start to think about using mediums, because if you paint purely outside what you asked before, if you paint purely out of the tube, you will have a very limited feel in those paintings. They will have the same thickness over them. They'll feel quite...
It's draggy as well.
Yeah.
It just feels gross.
And you'll go through these more paintings.
Yeah, lots of paint and it'll dry for a bit of while.
Yeah. So something else to take from sort of the medium glaze thing is it's not only, you can use that not only for going over colours, but actually starting a painting. So one of the best things I think to do at the start of a painting is get rid of the white, because I don't want to look at, I don't want to be reminded about how much my canvas cost me. I don't want to be precious about it, feeling like, oh, I don't want to screw this one up. As soon as I get rid of that white, I feel like it's a painting now. It doesn't matter what I do now, it's already a painting. It's just a total mental thing. And the way to do that is just make up a really light wash. I probably wouldn't do it entirely with that. I would mix some of that with a bit more of that and just wash over the whole surface really light. And then that's suddenly given you something to now work onto. You can either wait for that to dry and work on the top of it, or you can work into it wet, or you can get a rag and rub it back so that it's not super drippy, but you've added some sort of colour to that surface, and then begin to paint it. And it will also help create more depth in the painting.
Yeah.
And then Andre brought these in just so at least we can show you that if you were to make up your own medium, which again, we're using the low toxic stuff here, but say at home you might be interested in making your own medium, that's really going to be made up of basically just 3 components. So Wayne Conduit, who used to be a tech guy here for years and years, and was just a vast wealth of knowledge. I remember giving me the recipe that he said, Adam, all you'll need is 3 parts, right? So 1/3 is gum turpentine, 1/3 is refined linseed oil, and 1/3 is Daymar varnish. And you mix all that up, and that gives you your medium, just like this. And then you get some more gum turpentine, and you thin that medium out with it, depending on how thick or thin you want it. And that's all that you'll need, and I used that for years and years. Some people will substitute that with some stand oil, which just gives the medium more thickness, and it will take longer to dry because some oil painters like to stretch out the drying time as long as they can. Stand oil would also adds probably some more shine to the painting. I don't use it because I don't like it, but
it's just so draggy.
Yep.
Fine, and so Yeah.
so
Sticky.
that if you got any dust or cat hair in the room, it's going
Cat hair or beard hair, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I have not used this one, but you'll find variations of something like this in an art store, and the good thing about this is it's not really particularly pungent. This is basically just a type of medium that is, look, I can't even pour it. Oh, I can. It took a little while. It's like jelly, okay?
What's the name?
This one is just called, it's Neo-Megalith. I don't even know what that is, but there you go. But basically, a product like that is basically like another type of medium that is very, very thick. So some painters will want to fill out the bulkiness of their paint without using heaps and heaps of paint out of the tube. So you could mix paint into this and it will give you something more like a jelly sort of glutinous sort of consistency that will be semi-transparent in parts, that will take a long time to dry, that will be a painting that isn't flat and will have undulations to its surface. And so really it's stuff to just experiment with. Some people will love that, some people will find it absolutely irritating. So I guess the point is that there's a whole range of different mediums and solvents that you can explore. It just depends what you want to do with them, or how to experiment with them too. And the great thing is most of them are not super expensive materials to buy either.
I just missed one. You were talking about salts. It's gum, turpentine, dammartine, and scent oil.
Or
Well, salts.
refined linseed oil.
Fine.
You'll notice that I said refined linseed oil as opposed to the hardware one. Yeah. When you're washing your brushes in here, you need to use something like this. So don't go through heaps of it because this is a more expensive way of washing your brushes. What I would suggest is keep some of this in a little wash jar and just put the lid on that when you're not using it. Use that to wash the brush like this, then take the brush to the sink with a piece of paper towel, get rid of the excess like this, and then get yourself some soap and put it through the bristles, and then just wash it with warm water on your hand in a circle like that. That gets out nearly all.
So you want to get the terps off the bristles. Otherwise you get, unless you don't care, you get very dry, bristly bristles. And if you want to glaze, that's not so great. So keep them nice. I mean, when I learned oil painting a very long time ago, we had to put Vaseline on the brushes and shape them. Some teachers even got us to take them out of the silver, the metal filament and clean that out. It's really ridiculous. But if you want your brushes to stay in shape, Vaseline is a good idea. It just means that the next time you go to paint, there'll be a little bit of that residue there, which I don't like. So
Yeah.
it's up to you.
I think that's...
I think mediums are a huge topic. This is, I guess just the general rule is start with thinner layers, more terpsy, more solventy layers. Build the oil layers up towards the end of the painting, and then you'll avoid cracking and the artwork will be archival. Or be lazy like me, buy a synthetic type of medium like this, and you can do every layer with it. You can work thinly with it, you can work thickly with it, and it will survive. It'll be fine. It's just not cheap, that's all.
The only thing I'll reiterate, or maybe I'm not reading, I may not have said it, I can't remember. This product is not technically made to paint straight with. They say that you're meant to mix some of this with some medium or something else. And I would say that that's true. But you can at the same time.
I did make a painting with gum terps and it cracked.
Yeah,
So, it can be...
It depends what the painting is and how much pigment's in it and all that stuff. But just as a general rule, you want to have this and some medium, and you want to sort of be using them together. I would not suggest painting straight just with a turpentine or with a solvent. Okay?
It's a mix-up.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions about any of that, or about any of the products, or anything that doesn't make sense? Three things. Yes. That's totally fine.
Alright,
Come and have a look if you want, guys.
I'll repeat the recipe one more time. So if you want it right now, so it's gum turpentine, and it's refined linseed oil, and it's Damar. Damar. D-A-M-A-R. And it's 1/3 in. And then it's going to
Yeah. Wait, so why is that one where they put the fish over and then it's like cracked brown one? Yeah, it hasn't been cracked, so it's cracked, but if they put it on top of it. I have like sauce the same. Yeah, it's about. It reminds me of American Horror Story. It's so fun. Yeah, the fact that he's like, yeah. Sorry, that was too far. I know, I was like, just told me you didn't have to do anything. Should not have been able to watch that when I was 15. Why was it just like, anyway. And they were also saying like, if that was really big and they put that stuff in. Understand how it is for us because I kind of I just like feel like that basically ratio of that to paint at the beginning and when I don't enjoy paintings with just linseed oil and no sort of I guess it was the same, but it makes it a bit more. That's it comes through the oil, right? The solvent. Yeah, it just makes it a bit more like kind of like a acrylic.
That's a good idea, actually. I might do the same. Yeah, thank you.
go to the art store and buy that and buy that. Okay? And that will do the same thing as what I've described. Yes? Yep.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
Just use this one.
Yes?
Okay.
Nice to meet you. I mean, you can also probably mix a little bit of that with that too and see what happens. Yeah.
Okay, good.
This one? You can, that's what it's made for, but it will be more, a little bit thicker and it will be a bit shinier, a little bit more varnish in it. So that's why I like to add a little bit of that into it. Oh, okay. Okay. What's the credits from? What did you do beforehand?
Oh, here. I don't have this.
Yeah. I've been doing a little bit of this.
I've been hearing I say jelly.
Oh, that's painting on
It's good to learn. It's really good to learn.
You put
Then you have to go away.
sienna here and this.
When you sorry. Those kind of so last night I was looking at random artists and I saw an artwork and there's an artist that
Yeah.
and I thought them to come to me and I really liked them.
Yeah, I know. I've never heard of it.
Gum something. Linseed and then linseed oil and then something varnish. She said that there might be another M, but like I feel like it doesn't really matter. You should kind of know what it's supposed to be. And remember it's only at home. And then it's 3-part equal parts. You can just always just tip me and I have to come back to the air right now. That's okay.
Do you have any of your work in here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Adam?
Yeah.
Small question. I didn't see here, so it's ultramarine blue with this, right?
Yeah.
And here,
Yeah.
ultramarine blue with yellow acrylic.
Yes, and then some white.
Oh, yeah, okay. So, my question. So, when we use glazing, the reason we use glazing with the pigment because we want to make it more transparent to try to cover the painting.
That's one reason, yeah.
And what about another reason?
You might want to use it as a ground. A ground is the first thing you put down. You might want to start the canvas with a really washy and then work onto that. And it's also a way of stretching the colour out.
Yes.
Yeah?
So I saw a lot of people when they finish painting, they try to use glazing, try to brush on
All
the
over. Like a varnish.
Yeah, right.
I don't like that.
I don't like it.
No.
Too shiny.
I would leave that.
Okay.
It's what you also need to do when you do that is make sure the painting is complete. Like on the side of the varnish, it will say that the painting has to have been drying for at least 3 months. Otherwise, it will crack.
Okay.
So you don't need to varnish it unless you really want to.
Yes.
I don't know. Some people want this all over shininess to it. I don't understand. Yeah.
For me, I normally when I painting, I normally use I put it on the palette a little bit to mix.
Yes. Yeah. It's fine. Yeah. Saf said that she does what I did in there. She does it on the palette.
Me too. So, okay, my final question. So,
Yeah.
what's your ingredient here? What did
The
you put?
ingredients. It was some of that
Solvent and the oil.
and medium. About 2 parts medium, 1 part solvent, something like that.
Okay, so because I never put the solvent when I was raw.
You don't have to, but
I only use oil.
you only use oil while.
It's oil.
Okay, you can do that, yeah. But if you want to have it less shiny or you want to have it thinner, you can add a little bit of salt into it.
So solvent make it thinner.
Yes.
Wow, great. That's all my question. Thank you very much.
No worries.
So you said which one? 2 parts medium and 1 solvent for glazing?
Which one?
That's what you just said for glazing. 2 parts medium and 1 solvent.
1 low toxic solvent. The 2 in the front there. If you write those 2 down, the language ones.
What is that in here?
That's what I had. Yeah.
I realized last week. We went here last week. I was wondering just like what's going on. Because I saw
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
You feeling better?
Yes. That's just like I mean,
Yeah.
but I've seen like the foam stuff, and I just don't.
We'll get you started on that today. Have you looked at any of it on canvas?
I've been trying to. I don't really know how to use it, so I've been trying to like find everything.
How about, where's your studio? Spoken the same way. Alright. I will come and chat to you and take you through last week. Is that okay?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
No, no, hold on. Okay.
So where is the secret here?
Here on this level as well. So it's 1 there and there's 1 somewhere in there and then 1 there. And Andre, he's floating around somewhere, but why don't you check the second year studios to make sure your name is in? You need to find Andre then. Do you know where his office is? I think it's the next level up and down. Yeah, alright. No, I said there's some of that and then a little bit of that. That's all that was in there.
So you need to mix
Yep. Yep.
what percentage?
It depends how thick or thin you want it. What I did was about two-thirds, 1/3. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be that. You can. It depends how thick or thin you want it, or you can paint just with that.
And I wanted to ask, is there any theory when you put a certain color over for glazing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the blue. It's like what we talked about with complementary colours as well. The blue will turn the yellow into a green. But what you need to do is experiment with it and see what they will and won't do. Okay. So there's some theory to it, but there's also a bit of trial and error as well. So here, a blue on the top of a red is sort of created almost a purple, right? Very dark blue.
So we're glazing dark over the light.
No, it could be either.
So is there any theory in old masters how, for example, Rembrandt was glazing?
Yep.
Did you study that?
Yep.
So what is the theory?
Well, that's a much more complicated. So what they're doing is starting from very dark canvases, almost a black canvas, and painting light, and then bringing it back to dark, and then doing the lights again. It's a very different process. Yeah. But there's books in the library. You can look that up. You have to go and do your research on it.
Yeah, well, always was fascinating because it's not that I know we can experiment, but I always wanted to know how the masters did.
Yeah. Well, you could go and
Easy
do
way to life.
It's
Just come here.
you could go and do go and find a book on Rembrandt in the library and see if it explains, it describes his process. It's very different, very much more complicated. I think it's good to start with a much more basic thing of what we're showing you here, okay?
Yeah, but it's theory what glaze comes from first, second, to achieve something, is it?
You
I
need-
need to write it down and experiment
You need
myself.
to try it, you need to do it like so. So start with the materials that we've said. Start with the materials and the colours that we've said and see what you can make from it.
Thank you.
Alright?
Might stop the video.
Oh yeah. Just got all of mine. So there's 2 students who weren't here last